if you care about curbing climate change, you have to solve it indirectly rather than directly. Because, as I said, I think most people don't really care that much about climate change. You need new energy technologies that are better than the current ones, and better not just because they're low carbon, but because they provide some sort of advantage that large numbers of people actually value. An advantage on cost, or on convenience, or on economic growth, or on public health. Moreover, you need to make these technologies affordable not just in places like Silicon Valley, California, where I live, and where I see $100,000 Teslas plying the streets every day. You need to make these technologies affordable in developing countries, which is where nearly all the growth in global energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions is likely to come from over the next several decades, and where per capita wealth is a fraction of what it is in the West. Which brings us to solar. Some of the most powerful countries in the world have concluded that they have an economic incentive to go big in solar, and they're scaling it up. A former Saudi oil minister by the name of Sheikh Yamani once said something famous. He said, "The Stone Age came to an end not because we had a lack of stones, and the oil age will come to an end not because we have a lack of oil." What did he mean by that? He meant that energy transitions, he thinks, happen not because of a push, but rather because of a pull. That is to say, transitions happen not just when something runs out, but when something better comes along that in the public mind pulls people toward that new thing, even if the old thing is still around. Does that make sense? That, I would argue, is where we are right now. I told you a few minutes ago that we're in a golden age of energy abundance. We're swimming in fossil fuel. We are not running out of the old stuff, ladies and gentlemen. And yet we are moving to the new stuff, which I think, again, puts a premium on the cost competitiveness of the new stuff. So let me just give you a little bit of context about solar. I don't like throwing numbers at people, but I think some numbers are important. Does anyone know what percentage of global electricity comes from solar? Just shout it out. Excellent. We have a few experts in the room. Anyone farther back who's not an expert and didn't hear? Roughly 1.5%, depending on how you count it. That comes as quite as a surprise to people who read about the virtues of solar energy. So, just so we're all on the same page, coal is, again, this is percentage globally of electricity generation. Coal is 41%, natural gas is 22%, nuclear is 11%, hydro, water running through dams, is 16%, wind, 3%, and solar 1.5, something like that. Now, let me be very clear. Solar chinning 1% represents an extraordinary growth from where solar was 5 years ago. If you were to look at a very kind of rosy-looking chart that someone in the solar industry would show you, the chart would look like this. It's a great story. It's just a little different when you broaden out the lens and look at that against the backdrop of other energy sources. So I'm not here to tell you that solar is not going to get very big. It well may be, but we should be very cognizant of where we are today and where we are not. Now, in some places, because the world is a big place, in some places, solar represents a much bigger portion of electricity generation. In Italy, 8%, in Germany, 7%, Spain, 4%, Japan and Australia, 3% each. There's something called the International Energy Agency, which is based in Paris, which is kind of conventional wisdom on energy statistics. And the numbers I've been throwing at you come from the IEA. And the IEA predicts that solar could represent 16% of global electricity production by the middle of the century. Now, many people believe that that is far too conservative. Many people believe that's way too optimistic. But let's just be clear that 16% is quite different from 1 or 1.5%. Okay. So I really want to finish this in about 5 minutes to let you talk. So I want to dig in to China, and I'm going to go a little bit deep here, so please stay with me, and then I will be quiet and you can ask some questions. So let's just have a little bit of a history lesson about solar. There's a really actually fascinating exhibit about solar at the Expo. I spent about an hour there yesterday, and I really recommend it to any one of you who finds solar intriguing. I learned a lot actually about the kind of far history of solar. But for our purposes today, what's regarded as the modern photovoltaic cell, photovoltaic, generating electricity from light, was developed at a place in the country where I grew up called Bell Labs in 1954, so that's roughly 60 years ago. Solar kind of sputtered along as a science project for about 3 decades. It was used in space, on spaceships. It was used on mountaintops. It was used in rural villages. Essentially, it was used in places that had no choice, where there were no electrical lines supplying electricity. And so as a result, it didn't really matter what solar cost. People were willing to pay. That changed in the 1990s, first when Japan and then Germany, led by their governments, promulgated programs to try to deploy solar at what that point were quite large scales on rooftops, on regular people's rooftops. And we're not going to go into the details of that now, but suffice it to say that by the middle of the 2000s, Germany, a country with a solar resource akin to Alaska's, was the largest solar market in the world. That wasn't because of Germany's sun. That was because of Germany's incentives, Germany's subsidies. Now, let's move across the world to China. So there are some very smart entrepreneurs in China who, round about the early 2000s, woke up and realized that China had a pretty good track record of manufacturing goods for sale around the world at lower cost than most countries did. Televisions, computers, clothing, and it occurred to them, why not solar panels? It turns out that actually, while the solar industry would like you to believe that solar panels are quite technological, and indeed they are in terms of their development, the manufacturing is pretty straightforward. And so, to make a long story much shorter, these very smart entrepreneurs got backing largely from provincial governments in China, and they built factories which dwarfed anything that Germany had put up. And within a few short years, China had gone from producing nothing in solar to dominating the global solar market. Now, at the time, China wasn't deploying any of these solar panels in China. This was a purely export industry. China was sending these solar panels largely to Germany, to a lesser extent to other places in Europe that had promulgated very juicy incentives like Germany had, and also to the United States, which also had rolled out incentives. Just a data point, has anyone been to a place in China called the Yangtze River Delta? It's a little west of Shanghai, about 40 minutes on this high-speed train. The Yangtze River Delta, essentially 2 provinces in China, today produce 60%, 60, of all solar panels in the world. Whether China's rise as the dominant global solar player is a good thing or a bad thing depends on your perspective. If your goal is cheap solar power for the world, I'd argue, it's a good thing. If your goal is jobs manufacturing solar equipment in, say, Germany or the United States, it's not such a good thing. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why we are all witness, as I speak, to an intensifying trade war over solar panels. And again, we don't have time to go into them today. I'm happy to talk in more detail if that's interesting to you in the question time. But let's just say that there are very high-priced lobbyists who are being hired on all sides, making a lot of good money, arguing their case. And the allegation is twofold. The allegation is that Chinese companies have dumped solar panels, that is, they're selling solar panels below their production costs into the West to drive out competition. And number 2, that the Chinese government has, as a strategic matter, so identified solar as a growth industry that it is subsidizing that industry at a level that violates World Trade Organization rules. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not here to tell you who's right in this. This is clearly a legal question. What I am here to tell you is it says something about this industry that that some of the largest corporations in the world feel that it's important to have this fight. So, I want to highlight just a couple, and then I'm going to end. I want to highlight a couple conclusions from this report that we did. And what we did for this report is take 2 years, a long time, spend a lot of time on the ground in China, go deep into what's happening in the Chinese solar industry, and try to tease out some conclusions about what that says about China's comparative advantages in the global solar industry, on the theory that solar is relevant to clean energy industries much more broadly, and what that suggests other countries should rationally do if they want to play in an economically sustainable way in this game. So, let me give you a couple of conclusions and then I'm going to stop. First, the Chinese solar industry is undergoing a bruising consolidation, with some companies going out of business and others trying to weather profit margins that are razor thin. But the Chinese solar industry is likely to dominate the global market for many years to come. So other countries that want to build viable domestic solar manufacturing industries and that want to deploy lots of solar panels, whether it's the United States or Germany or Spain or Kazakhstan, would do well, I think, to structure their strategies not to try to bury China, but rather to try to leverage it. Their goal, again, ought to be to discern their comparative economic strengths. In this context, it's worth noting that tariffs that have been imposed by countries, including the United States, that want to disadvantage imports of renewable energy equipment from China and thereby promote their own domestic solar products, have not worked out as planned. Again, I won't go deep in the weeds on this, but the United States imposed these sorts of tariffs against imported Chinese solar products, and the facts are that there is not a massive resurgence of solar manufacturing in the United States, and indeed tariffs that were then imposed by China on the United States on a different kind of solar product have actually eroded more economic value from the solar industry in the United States than the tariffs that the US imposed have added. So tariffs don't always work out the way you think they're going to work out, particularly in an industry that's globalizing as quickly as solar. Number two, though it's fashionable for Europeans and Americans to believe that all China does is manufacture at low cost technologies that great minds developed in the West, the reality is that China is becoming much more than a cheap global factory floor. It's becoming a global solar innovator. I'm going to give you one data point. There is in the United States something called the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. It's located in Colorado, and it leads global research in many respects in many technologies, including solar. There's a chart that the geeks of solar around the world publish, and you can go and Google this, it's available for free, and it traces world records in solar over the past perhaps half century. And here's the bottom line. That chart is dominated by European and American companies, Australian companies as well, Japanese companies as well, industrialized Western, effectively, economies, until 2 years ago when a Chinese solar company won a place on the chart for the first time. How that happened is pretty interesting, and I think what it suggests is that if you look at that chart in 5 or 10 years, you're going to see more Chinese dots on it. So the notion that China doesn't innovate is yesterday's notion, and I'd suggest that people who continue to believe it do so at their peril. Last one, and then I'm going to stop. China's solar market, even though it is funded by lots of money, presents a pretty major potential investment opportunity for Western financiers. One of the things that was most striking to me about spending a decent amount in China working on this is the extent to which very sophisticated financial players in China have come to the conclusion that China is spending its money on clean energy fairly badly. I'm not criticizing here, I'm reflecting an argument from people who live in the country and help run it. And the point is, what they've realized is that if China is going to achieve its very aggressive goals for deploying solar energy, the most aggressive goals really in the world, it's going to have to get much smarter about the financial structures that it uses to deploy that money. And it needs Western help in doing that. So to the extent that any of you in this room are in the business of providing money or providing structures for the use of money, and I can tell you there are many people in the United States who are kind of salivating at this prospect, that is a big opportunity. And so, again, the notion that there's this relationship between China and the West that's like this is a counterproductive notion, not just for the planet, but also for the pocketbooks of a lot of people involved. I'm going to stop there, and I would love you to jump in if there's something you'd like to jump in about. Thanks very much. I was so boring that no one has any question. Is that right? I don't know how this works. Is there a microphone, or should they just stand up and ask a question? I think right over there.
It's slightly off topic, but what's your, you spoke a lot about the solar example and the renewables, and you touched a part of their penetration in the whole energy matrix. But my opinion is, don't you think that we should start shifting the conversation from sources to energy carriers? And I'm a hydrogen guy, so that's why I'm going to this question.
Yeah, no, it's an absolute. Did everyone hear the question? The question is that the discussion about an energy transformation ought to be about more than a transformation in the sources of energy. It ought to be about a transformation in the way that we use energy, including carriers of energy like hydrogen. Absolutely. I had to focus on something, so I focused on what I focused on. But fair point, and I believe that there's going to be a lot of discussion about energy efficiency as this conference continues. I will just say, as an observer of kind of what I think is a really fascinating grand economic competition that we're witnessing, whether it's hydrogen, let's say particularly in the transportation sector, whether it's hydrogen or whether it's electric cars, that is to say battery-powered electric cars, remains an open question. And I think I can segment the sort of 15 years that I've spent watching this into periods when the world was certain that it was going to be one or the other, and they were always wrong. So I don't envy people who have their life savings invested in these technologies, because I think one thing that you ought to walk away here remembering is that if you think you know the silver bullet, you're probably going to be wrong. And if you're going to invest based on that, you better get your returns soon, because tomorrow you may lose it. Please, yes. Hi.
Why is it that people and groups consistently underestimate the prospect of photovoltaics?
Did everyone hear the question? Why do groups around the world consistently underestimate the potential of photovoltaics, of solar? One idea, and everyone in here can offer another one. Look, the energy system is massive. Inertia is a powerful force. There are vested interests, and I'm not criticizing those vested interests. Look, before we get sanctimonious in this room and talk about the big bad oil companies or the big bad coal companies, let's all remember how we got here today, and let's remember what's powering the lights in this room. So when we talk about energy companies, they are us. At the end of the day, because they're selling to us. But absolutely, the established economic order has an interest in preserving itself. I think what's so interesting is, and I think it's probably true that people underestimate the rate of technological transformations across the board, whether it's photovoltaics or energy more broadly. It happened with RAM and computers too. I will just say that what I think is really fascinating is that you are starting to see massive corporations, which 5 years ago laughed off photovoltaics, come out and admit publicly that they were sorely wrong to laugh off photovoltaics, and that they did their shareholders a disservice in laughing off photovoltaics. Now, whether those companies, the sort of traditional energy companies, are nimble enough to shift so that they can dominate these new industries as they have dominated the old industries is, I think, an open question. But for the planet, I think what's particularly interesting is that they're now invested in trying, and I'm fairly convinced this is about more than PR. This is about a realization that they've come to in the past couple of years that if they don't, their shareholders are going to be the losers for it. I think there's one over here, just in the interest of spreading it around.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And I present Green Academy. We was coordinator for NDC in Kazakhstan. Of course, the transition to low carbon in Kazakhstan is a very, very hard, very difficult process. And could you share your vision? Should the government support transition to low carbon through financial instrument, economic instrument, or politician? What's your opinion? Should government to support of transition to low carbon through different instruments? Thanks.
Well, far be it from me to venture any advice to the Kazakh government about what it should do in this area. But I will just say that I think the consensus among other countries that are involved in this is that they have to do something. Now, I think that's the easier question. The more interesting question is, what do they do? And Ben is going to push me off the stage if I don't end this soon. But I think it's worth, if you're really interested in this, examining the extent of the differences in what different countries have chosen to do. There really are vast differences in the strategies that countries have chosen. What unites them is that those strategies aren't working fast enough. And I think at the end of the day, it's realistic to surmise that the reason is that there is simply not the political will to yank those levers to the extent that those levers would need to be yanked to undertake a transformation much more radical than the one here. You may lament that, you may wish it were different, but I think it's fair to say that it's not different. And those of you who want to affect a change have to operate in the reality that that's the case. Let me just say one last thing a little more specifically. I think it's worth being cognizant of the fact several of you who have come here are from Europe, and I as a journalist have written in the past about something called the emissions trading scheme in Europe, the notion of trading essentially reductions in carbon. And I just think it's worth our remembering as a matter of history that there was massive excitement about this, say, 10 years ago. There's not so much excitement about this right now. That is because the prices of these things have plummeted. And again, that's because the political will, I think, to push them is not what people expected it would be. But look, last thing I'll say, I mean, I'm fascinated by the extent to which dominant countries that dominate the fossil fuel industry globally, Saudi Arabia is one, are getting very, very thoughtful about how they can diversify their resources. Again, not because, I'm sure they say to the world that it's because they want to help the climate, and I believe that as human beings they do, but underlying that is a much more fundamental motive, which is an economic motive. If you believe that that the world is going to shift from oil to something else, ultimately shift from fossil fuels to something else, if you're a dominant player in those industries, you want to be in the new industries as well. You want to ride that curve as easily as you can do it. And so I think that's a massive change from 5 or 10 years ago. Thanks.